Good afternoon. May I call the chamber to order? Thank you very much. My name is Luis Garcia de Brigard. I will be Speaker of the House tonight. And while this is an education conference, I think every hallway, every meeting room has seen discussions about what's the future of the world in face of the recent and upcoming electoral events. And what better way to address the matter than by debating the motion in front of the House today. This House believes that the rise of populism is the result of the failure of education. We do have a phenomenal lineup of speakers with us this afternoon. For the motion, Ms. Irina Bokova, who's the Director General of UNESCO since 2009. She was re-elected in 2013 for a second term, and she's the first woman ever to lead the organization. Also for the motion is Ms. Lucy Lake, Chief Executive of CAMFED International, an organization that promotes girls' education in Africa. She's also a founding member and former chair of the United Nations Girls' Education Initiative. Against the motion this afternoon is Ms. Rebecca Winthrop, who's Director and Senior Fellow of the Center for Universal Education at Brookings. She has been advisor for multiple governments and institutions around the world, including initiatives by Ban Ki-moon, Hillary Clinton, Michelle Obama, and Gordon Brown. With her against the motion is Mr. George Papandreou, former Prime Minister of Greece, also a former Minister of Education, and a former foreign minister for his country. Please join me in welcoming our speakers. We are going to move ahead with the initial vote. You will all have a clicker with you. I'm going to read the motion once again. This House believes that the rise of populism is the result of the failure of education. We will open the voting now, and please remember that 1 is for the motion, 2 is against the motion, and 3 or C is undecided. You can proceed to vote now. 10 seconds to vote. Okay. So we have a 57% for the motion, 28% against the motion, and then 15% undecided. We will see what happens after the arguments by our speakers. And before I give the floor to them, let me remind you of the rules today. We will have 7 minutes for each one of the speakers on both sides. So it's a total of 14 minutes each to present their arguments for and against the motion. After that, we will have a period of questions and answers by other participants in the debate. I do ask the participants to ask brief questions and address specifically either side of the debate tonight. And after that, we will have once again the vote. So without further ado, I'm going to give the floor to Ms. Irina Bokova, who is going to speak for the motion. You try the other mic and see if that, okay.
I hope this is not said by our opponents. So please take this minute from my speech. Honorable Speaker, Luis Garcia, Excellency, Mr. George Papandreou, former Prime Minister of Greece, dear Ms. Rebecca Winthrop, Director of the Center for Universal Education, ladies and gentlemen, let me first say that probably not in the best experience and history of parliamentary democracy, I would like to say that I have tremendous respect for our opponents. And also that I see this democratic debate not as a fight, against each other, against our ideas, but as a search for solutions, as a search for truth, because I think both the questions about rising populism in the world and the role of education is of prime importance. And that is why I'm here to defend this motion of the House. Let me say that in an article from last August on the rise of populism, I think first we should speak about the rise of populism. Ronald Inglehart, the University of Michigan, and Pippa Norris from the Harvard Kennedy School defined populism as expressing resentment of existing authorities, whether big business, big banks, multinational corporations, media pundits, elected politicians, government officials, intellectual elites, scientific experts, and I would say the arrogant and privileged rich. And on this basis, both researchers found that across Europe, the share of seats gained by populist politicians in national and European parliamentary elections has tripled since 1960s, going from 3.8% to 12.8%. And we can see similar trends in other parts of the world. These are quite uncomfortable facts. And the question that we are exploring today is what is driving this rise and how we can respond to it. There are many answers to this question, as of course there are many political opinions. Some analysts point to growing inequality and social exclusion. Others highlight a cultural backlash against long-term ongoing social change, including globalization. The common ground in all arguments is the rise of mistrust and frustration, combined with perceptions of marginalization and, to some extent, lack of control. So, what can we say about education in all this? It has long been argued that education and politics are linked. In fact, we know that education, in my view, also is the best defense the country could invest in order to protect itself. And we know some researchers also, like John Dewey, the founder of progressive education, said that education and democracy are very interconnected. This means the reverse should also be true. The rise of populism cannot be delinked from education. In this light, one may argue also that the rise of populism reflects a failure of the promise of education, I add, among other things. This being said, let us spin this argument on its head and look to education as an answer to the rise of populism. I'm convinced that education must be an essential part of all the efforts to tackle rising populism, but not just any education. And I think this conference that we are here about global citizenship education is also one of the answers to this trend of rising populism. We need to transform the education for the 21st century to meet the needs of increasingly interconnected world. It's a world that is very diverse, diverse societies, diverse cities, but also when we see that intolerance is on the rise. So when the planet faces these rising challenges, pressures, societies who are more vulnerable than ever, I think these global solutions to these global challenges should definitely encompass education, creating a new sense of global solidarity beyond borders, including all societies. So what are these new approaches to education? I believe the transformation of education today must take two angles, which practically already we see are embodied in the goal number 4 of the Sustainable Development Agenda for the world. The first angle, of course, is the equity in education, to ensure every girl and boy have access to quality education and that every woman and man also have access to quality lifelong learning. This is how we tackle one of the reasons that breeds populism, sense of exclusion and sense of lack of hope also for the future. I think this is essential for widening the empowerment of education to all members of society, particularly to the most marginalized. The genuinely inclusive education is an essential motor also for greater innovation, for productivity, leading to poverty eradication, and I would say in the developed world, in the rising economies also, to the economic growth, jobs, and sense of belonging. But access, we know, is not enough. We must also transform the content of education. Today, education, we all know, and this conference is all about, it is not just transferring information. It is not just transferring knowledge. It is about learning to live in a world which is diverse, which in some cases is under pressure, which is constantly transforming. And that is why we say that education is the best transformative power a society and community may have. But it is also about new forms of cultural literacy and media literacy. It is about connecting the dots between the social, the economic, and environmental dimensions of sustainable development. We need new values, new skills for new times, to nurture critical thinking, to give learners tools to make the most of diversity, to develop new behaviors, and also a new type of solidarity to respect the pressures and the boundaries of our planet. So I think this is the importance of education for sustainable development, and this is how we will respond to the rising populism. We need this type of education for the 21st century if we want still to have education as a public good and to link education, democracy, social inclusion, and economic growth. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. I now give the floor to Mr. George Papandreou against the motion.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, Your Honorable Chair, Irina, good friend, Lucy, and Rebecca, when I heard the issue, my knee-jerk reaction as a former Minister of Education was, yes, of course, education is central, and it is central to many things in our lives. But then thinking about this question, I found three basic reasons why we cannot blame education for populism. Now, one reason is that I think this is a disservice. It's an injustice to education. There are other reasons. We were talking this morning about funding in education. In the US now, the budget is going to military, not to education. Minister of Zimbabwe said that the cost of the expenditures of the president of Zimbabwe are 100 times more in his transportation than the education budget. But others said, Minister of Venezuela, that even in a country which had been an educated country, people chose Chavismo, that is in economic welfare over freedom, but now they have neither. Of course, another issue, this is more about violence and terrorism, those who perpetrated 9/11, they were educated. But there's another reason, and it is that if we scapegoat education, we are hiding the real culprits and the real problems of society. There are some deep issues. 2008, we had the financial crisis. People lost pensions. People lost jobs. People lost their houses. It was not education that was the problem. In the global markets, there's huge inequality. 1% in the United States own 90% of the income compared to everybody else. And Oxfam has come up with 8 people in the world owning half of the wealth of the world. So this inequality has broken down what we call a social contract, and education, of course, was part of the social contract. It has broken down the trust, it has broken down our institutions, and it has made even education itself having soaring costs in many parts of the world, and therefore lack of access to education. Now, I would add to this that we also have a technological revolution that's giving us great opportunities, but it also is threatening parts of our society. I see here that 47% of the labor force in the United States are susceptible to automation. They may lose their jobs. 30% of them are afraid of robots, that they may take their jobs. So there's a deep sense of insecurity. And can education help here? Well, maybe it can. Maybe it can for the future generation. Maybe it will not. Maybe jobs will be lost forever. But there will certainly be people that will be left out on the streets, unemployed, even in this transition, and they are very insecure. Refugees. Can education help? Certainly it can. I was a refugee. I learned the language of a country I lived in, Sweden. I integrated into Sweden, but the real issue is the conflict in Syria. The real issue are conflicts around the world. The real issues will be climate change and our societies and the inflows of huge numbers, particularly combined with the breakdown of the social contract, has given great fodder to populists and scapegoating refugees and migrants. I'd also want to say a few things about social media and media in general. The school was the center of socialization. No longer. Conventional media, but now social media even more, are socializing our society. And of course, that gives us great skills of communication. But it also dumbs us down. Tweet, 140 words. Critical thinking, analytical thinking, synthetic thinking in 140 words. This massive information flow. And that's not the school that's doing that. That's this internet revolution. Now the school could help. But we're also seeing the concentration of power in the internet. We think it's an equalizer, but there's a lot of concentration. Whether it's on our privacy, it's whether we're looking what people are following, whether it's Google or Facebook, the huge amount of power that they are wielding, and of course, seeing us much more as consumers than as global citizens or citizens of our countries. So education is facing a huge uphill battle. Let's not blame education. Let's not blame education for these new phenomena which we have to deal with as societies. Finally, from my experience, I would say that there's an issue, it's a third point here I want to make, of democracy. The huge concentration of power in wealth, in media, has undermined our political institutions. Whether it's lobbies, which is, I would say, legal corruption, whether it is outright corruption, whether it's the capture of politics, whether it's the fact that most likely millionaires are the ones that can become, in many parts of the developed world, politicians, whether it is the fact that it's very difficult to participate in a very real way, we see marginalization, we see alienation, we see people very frustrated about the decisions that are being made. And you know, these tablets and our smartphones could actually be a revolution in democracy. But in fact, we have a virtual world. We think that getting on Facebook or through our Google partners or whatever, that we're actually participating. But we aren't really making the decisions, someone else
30
is.
seconds.
So in fact, it's fake participation, bringing fake news and fake solutions. I believe that education, as in ancient Greece, yes, it was theater, philosophy, many other things, but it also was participation. It also was giving certain powers to the citizen to be both responsible and also rights. And in this globalizing world, people are feeling very alienated and powerlessness. We have to look at the structures, the system. Let's not scapegoat education. Yes, education has to be central in a just and open and democratic world, but let's not scapegoat it. Let's see the real problems of the system. Let's change the system so that education can play its real role. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Papandreou. Lucy, please.
Mr. Speaker, honourable ladies and gentlemen, let me start by quoting Donald Trump, who said after winning the Nevada caucus to the crowd in an unguarded moment, "I love the poorly educated." Mr. Trump clearly saw a link between a failure in education and a rise in populism, and look where he is now. I could stop there. But let me not leave the last word to Mr. Trump. And let me not leave
simplistic assumptions and generalizations on the table, because I see that they're a big part of the problem. It is a fact, an indisputable fact, whichever way you cut the analysis and with every other factor controlled for, that there is a link between levels of education and the people who voted for Brexit and for Trump in the presidency. But we shouldn't jump from that correlation to the conclusion that the failure of education is leading to the rise in populism, because that's what we're here to debate. We're here to debate, is there a causal link? And to get to this, I want us to ask a more challenging question, not why the so-called poorly educated voted for Brexit and Trump, but why so many of the so-called highly educated set aside facts to vote for Trump and for Brexit. Set aside facts about climate science, for example. Set aside facts about the benefits of free trade. Populism implies unreason, and education should be the epitome of reason. So a rise in populism implies a failure of education in its classic sense. The hold of education in its modern form was too weak to counter the emotional appeal of Trumpism, and too weak to counter the appeal of Brexit. And I would say, and to pick up on George's point, it's too weak to counter the new media ecosystem of fake news and to enable people to cut through that. So what is it about education that has failed? There are many facets and not enough time to explore this, but let me take one, and let me take it through telling a personal story, through telling you about the biggest professional bet that I've made in my career. A few years ago at CamFed, we were offered a major grant, a transformative grant, a once-in-a-lifetime grant, a grant that would enable us to improve the education outcomes at secondary level for some of the world's most marginalized girls. But there was a dark side to this grant. It was payment by results linked to learning outcomes. And if we didn't push up the learning outcomes, not by a little, but by a lot, and among the most marginalized, then we would have lost that money and our organization would have gone down. I decided to take that risk. And in taking it, we could have gone down the conventional route. We could have hot-housed cohorts of students to improve their results in academic subjects. But that would have been counter to our values in working for systemic change. And we needed to achieve these results at scale in hundreds of thousands of people. This couldn't just be a pocket of best practice. And this was the premise on which I took that risk. My working assumption was that a failure in education was leading to a sense of disenfranchisement, and that if we could deal with this link, we would see a direct effect in the push-up in young people's education outcomes. So that's what we did. We worked to build young people's sense of their own self-worth and agency. We co-created with them, with their teachers and with their communities, new learning resources and approaches to bridge the distance to the formal academic curriculum, resources that focused on autonomy, on voice, and on empowerment, and that dismantled the sense of other and better, which those young people were continually exposed to and which was reinforcing their own sense of marginalization. And now we have the results, the hard evidence that it has worked. In 991 secondary schools, we've seen self-efficacy among young people shoot up. We've seen that they see that education is now relevant to their lives. They feel positive about the future. And beyond these so-called soft skills, we've seen a huge improvement in the academic results. In Tanzania, for example, in the intervention schools, children achieved results in maths 500% higher than in comparison schools. And young people who are leaving school are going on to take up positions in local authorities. Our learned friend, Jordan Shapiro, came to Tanzania to see the model in action, and he can much more eloquently than me tell you how it worked. But it did work. So I stand here as living proof that a failure in education leads to a sense of disenfranchisement, but that education in its best form leads to empowerment and engagement. I had much to lose. I've spent 23 years building CamFed as an organization, and if I'd got that supposition wrong, our organization would have gone down, and I would have gone down with it. So in summary, let me put it to the House that a failure in education leads to a sense of disenfranchisement, and that this, in turn, manifests itself in different ways and in different contexts. And one way in which we've seen it manifest itself is in a rise in populism. And as my colleague Irina says, it's not the only factor, but it is a factor, and it is an important factor. And I put it to you today that we have to accept that it is a factor, because it's only when we accept it that we can leave this chamber asking ourselves a much more challenging question, which is why and what can we do about it? Because then it becomes all our responsibility to address it. It's too big to sit on the shoulders of educators, because it will take all of us, leveraging all of our resources, to take it on.
Thank you very much. Rebecca Winthrop, please, against the motion.
Thank you. Members of the House, I would like you to close your eyes for a minute. Just close your eyes. Do they do that in the House? Oh, yeah. Anyways,
Please
close your eyes. Imagine you are a school teacher in a little town in rural America, and you are teaching about diversity, and you're teaching about social studies and the world's cultures, and you're teaching about Islam and Christianity and history, and people have all sorts of questions, and you're talking about it, and you're open to dialogue, and then imagine you go home, and after a very long, hard day's work, and you turn on the TV, and you hear the President of the United States say this: "I think Islam hates us." There's a tremendous hatred. And then you hear him say, "Those Mexicans, they're taking our jobs. They're taking our manufacturing jobs. They're taking our money. They're killing us." Okay, you may open your eyes now. Are you to blame? You're the teacher in that rural community. You've done all you can to foster diversity. Is it your fault that Donald Trump said that? I'm sick of this. I'm sick of educators being scapegoated for problems of other people, and it's not fair. First of all, I'd like to remind us that economic injustice is a real problem. Is that teachers who are working every day to educate our children, is it their fault? They're not making that much money. They're not the ones who are causing economic injustice. They're not among, I don't believe, the 8 richest people in the world. A single one of them is a teacher, holding half the world's resources. That's a real problem. Now, I want to remind you of the motion before you. The motion before you is that education is the result of populism. Now, I grant you, there are some elements of education. It's a piece of the picture, but by no means is it the result. And let's stop scapegoating education. So, in addition to the economic injustice issue, which my honorable colleague George Papandreou put before you, I want to add a few other issues. One is this idea of group threat. Now, this is human nature, and I don't believe education is to blame for human nature. I think there's such things as biology and psychology and human development, and I don't think we should blame teachers and principals and curriculum developers for that. Now, when people feel threatened, and this is a very widely held psychological pattern, they retreat into a us-them mindset. I'll give you an example from Somalia. Before Somalia had a civil war, almost 90% of all the people in Somalia identified as Somali. That was their identity. After many years of civil war, so threatening, insecure, economic hardship, almost the entire country identifies with their clan, not with their country. Now, this is a piece of the phenomena that's going on in populism. Because of economic insecurity, because of technology taking away jobs, because of poor planning amongst economic development practitioners, who we should not blame educators for, people are being threatened. They're losing work, they're not being retrained. There are real losers to globalization, and we need to humanize the face of globalization. And that is not the fault of schools around the world. And many people are, including leaders in the United States and the UK and people around the world, are taking hold of that and using the argument around losers and people being threatened to frame the debate in terms of us and them. You know, Mexicans versus us in the United States. I'm an American. And of course, there's many, many Mexicans in America. So that doesn't work out so well for them. So this is another piece of why populism is rising. Another issue that has nothing to do with schools, principals, students, ministries of education are the stupid people in the cybersecurity protection departments in my own country and many other countries who can't seem to figure out what's going on with hacking and cyber threats. It is not the fault of teachers around the world that Russian hackers managed to hack into the US election and did quite a bit of leaking and had a big effect one way or the other in the US election. I don't think we should blame teachers for that. I think we should blame our cybersecurity experts. They're very well educated, but they couldn't quite figure out what to do. It's not teachers' fault. It's not education's fault. Sure, global citizenship is important. Sure, analysis is important. Sure, critical thinking is important. It's a piece of the puzzle. But by no means should we scapegoat education. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're now opening it to questions from the floor. I do ask interested persons in asking questions to please say your name and tell us who you are addressing the question to. The gentleman.
Hi, my name's Lee Hole. I'm a secondary school principal within GEMS. Does the House feel that greater accountability for global citizenship would result in a reduction in populism?
Who are you addressing the question to?
Either.
You care to respond?
Thank you very much for this question. Yes, I do believe, and I would like to say that the House does not blame the education. I think there is an underlying perception, a different perception of the approaches of us and our opponents, because we do not blame educators, we do not blame teachers, we blame politicians, we blame those who should take responsibility for supporting teachers to tackle these issues, and this is where global citizenship education comes into the picture. We blame those who do not invest in education. We blame those because we know that populists know very well what education could bring to them. Populists do not believe in education as a public good in most of the cases. Populists are not supporting investing in education systems. Populists like to have ignorant people. Populists are those who introduce in curricular divisive histories, language, stories, curricular. And this is where I believe global citizenship comes once again in order to give response to the challenge of rising populism. And then the last, I think it's important. In order to understand all these trends, and I agree with our opponents on the reasons for the rising of populism, you need to have people with critical thinking. Otherwise, you will not understand what is at stake when we speak about this rising inequality, what is at stake when we see the unfairness of business practices, of banks, of financial systems, and otherwise. You need to have people who could resist this and who could change this. As here coming into the hall, we have pictures of quotations, and Paulo Freire, the big educationist from Brazil, there was something down which I think is very relevant to our debate. Now it came to my picture. Education does not change things. Education changes people who change things. And I think this is the role of education.
Thank you very much. The lady has a question.
Thank you very much. My name is Marlou van Beek. I'm from the Netherlands. 3 days ago we had an election. And I'm very happy with the election that we had. There was no populism, or the populism win in the Netherlands. And I hope that we can be an example for Europe, because also France, also Germany has elections. And my question is also for the opposition, Mr. Papandreou, and What will not help is that we close our eyes. What will not help, I'm sorry, that we will blame. But we have to change the system. And why do we have to wait till the system changes? We all know that systems change is a very long term. When we look at young people, we see children from 10 years till 15 years who have really great ideas, who are passing the systems.
Your question, please.
My question is, are you sure that you want to wait till we can change the system? I think there's more urgency.
Congratulations to Holland. I think we were all very happy. And certainly, I'm not going to wait. And we don't want to wait to change the system. But that doesn't mean that there aren't injustices. And there are great achievements in education. There are, I mean, Lucy, what you talked about, my honorable opponent, I haven't seen what you've done. I've heard about what you've done. And there are many people really giving their whole souls, their selves, their hearts to helping in education. Education is crucial. No one denies that. And certainly education is crucial in Holland too. But also in Holland, they still have a social contract. They also have a very free and diverse society. Inequality is not really the hallmark of Holland. People, you walk down the streets of Holland and people, you don't really know who's the rich and the poor. You don't have the sense of insecurity. There will be, of course, those. There are parts of our population, because of globalization, because of unemployment, because of lack of skills, that, yes, of course, that is what these people tap into. And of course they want people to be dumb. And of course they want to be able to manipulate. And of course education and critical thinking will be important. But we also have to change the system. Actually, I myself, Irina, honorable opponent, my dear Irina, I had worked with Paulo Freire many years ago in Greece. I invited him to Greece and I was working with adult education just after the dictatorship. And we went around organizing civic education around Greece. But we had a dictatorship before that. We couldn't speak, there was no freedom. Our education system was geared to dumb down people. We talked about Socrates and Aristotle, but never about the essence of what they said, because it was too revolutionary. So only when we brought democracy could we have education. Actually, John Dewey talks about this. Democracy and education go together. So let's see some of the problems we have in our democratic system, some of the inequalities that are undermining our institutions, some of the issues that are creating societies with huge injustices. And let's make sure, because populists like to scapegoat. They scapegoat Muslims, they scapegoat Mexicans, they scapegoat Roma, they scapegoat. I found that we were scapegoated in Greece during the economic crisis. Let's not scapegoat education. Thank you.
Thank you. The lady on the side, please.
Hi, my name is Helena, and I live and work in Jordan. My question is for the FOR team, because I'm not sure I completely understand the argument. It sounds like both sides are in agreement that education is part of the solution. But the statement says, this House believes that the rise of populism is the result of the failure of education. I thought I heard from one of you that you said you agree on the causes of education with your opponent. So are you kind of conceding what's stated here and changing? Because I'm hearing a lot of agreement, actually.
Thank you. Would like to answer the question?
I mean, I think there... Is that working? You hear me? Yes. I think there are many ways in which we do actually fundamentally agree. We're all educationalists, and we're looking at ways in which education can be transformational. I think what we're saying is that we have to accept that a failure in education is a cause of the rise in populism, because it's only if we accept that that we can then move forward to do something about it.
Thank you. On this side, the gentleman right here.
Thank you. Let me pass it on first to my colleague.
You're very generous. David Johnson, University of Oxford. Some years ago, like many of us, quite appalled with the London bombings. The British media, extraordinary, the headline shouted, how could they do this? They were British born and British educated. Now, I find it extraordinary, I'm a psychologist, that anyone might suggest that educational attainment in how long we go to school for, or educational achievement in how much or what it is we learn, is a strong predictor of what we might do.
We do appreciate if you address the
circumstances.
question, please.
So the question really is, would those proposing for the motion agree with me that we cannot predict how educated or not so well-educated people might act under different circumstances?
Right Honourable Speaker. I think the questions, it was mentioned also by our opponents that the attackers of 9/11 also were educated people. I believe here we're speaking about something else. When we speak about educated people, we are not speaking only about people who know how to write and read. We don't speak only about people who know how to go to their Facebook pages or to use their Twitter account. We are speaking about the values, and this is about global citizenship education that it is here. It is about what kind of education, what kind of values we instill in young people. And I think many educational systems have neglected for quite a long time this type of content of educations. I could give you an example, another example from Iraq. After Daesh invaded Iraq and destroyed the Mosul Museum and then moved on, and I went twice to Iraq, to Baghdad, and the first time I went and I asked the Prime Minister al-Abadi, I went to the University of Baghdad and I wanted to engage with young people, and I asked the Prime Minister, I said, Mr. Prime Minister, you have a problem. You want to reconcile your society. You want to do something for this process. Tell us how we can help. And by the way, we were very strongly involved at that time with technical vocational training and all different kinds of children getting to school, access to education. And the response of the Prime Minister was the following. He said, bring us back into school history, humanities, social sciences, because our children, our young Iraqis do not know that we are a very diverse society. They do not know the values. They do not feel identity, sense of belonging. They do not feel attachment to the Iraqi identity. And without this, we will continue to have extremism. We will continue to have violence and terrorism. And I think this is where we come to the issue of global citizenship education. And we sometimes forget, and I want to enlarge a little bit using your argument, where are the universities? What is the role of universities? When we speak education, we don't speak only about primary schools and teachers. We speak about intellectual capacity of universities to give response to this rising populism. And this is where I think also the education comes into the picture, with its intellectual debate, with its profound responses, with its value system, with linking it indeed to the public good of education, which is so much linked also to democracy. And I would just want to commend the recent article which I read today.
I think
of
we're
Professor
already
Fernando.
moving into the closing arguments.
Well, I'm stopped here. But it's very important that you read the article about universities and global citizenship and the rise of populism.
Please read the article.
Of Professor Fernando Reyes.
Unfortunately, we do not have time for more questions from the floor, so we will move into the closing arguments, and we will begin, of course, with the closing arguments for those that are in favor of the motion. Closing arguments, please. You arguing against each other. 3 minutes, please.
Well, I think really just to be able to pick up on the points that my honourable speaker next to me has said, that the role of education is important, that education is the best defence, that we are here looking at the issue of how do we bring through education relating to global citizenship. And I think if we are prepared to leave this chamber and take that on, and for all of us to take that on, for all of us to take responsibility. You mentioned, Irina, about looking at how we link universities and bringing their engagement into the public good of the wider education system, then I think that we have a movement, we have a surge that will counter the rise in populism, but it will be all our responsibility and not for us to put it on the shoulders of teachers and educators to solve it alone.
Thank you very much. Please, 3 minutes for your closing argument.
All right, thank you very much to my honorable colleagues who I believe have conceded the debate and that agree with us, because you have conceded that education is a factor, but that is indeed not the proposition we are debating. We are debating that education is the result, the factor in the rise of populism. So I appreciate that. You will make our winning the debate that much easier. And I just want to recap for you some of our arguments. One is that you can certainly acknowledge that education has a role to play, but education is not a panacea for solving all the world's problems. It is often, I remember my dissertation advisor, a woman at the University of Minnesota, who was then at Columbia University, where I was studying, named Fran Vavris, wrote a book called Education is Not a Panacea, because she got so sick and tired of politicians saying, well, you just educate them and then we'll have, vast economic growth and there will be jobs everywhere and people will love each other and conflict will be stopped. So education is not a panacea, and we should stop scapegoating and trying to think that education can do absolutely everything without looking seriously at other factors. Second of all, we need to, this scapegoating actually is a serious problem, because it means it masks really delving into serious issues around the lack of humanization of the face of globalization, which includes not focusing on economic injustice. It includes not focusing on the massive change in digital communications and trying to figure out how to keep that up. And no matter how sophisticated you are in terms of global citizenship and tolerance levels, you're not going to solve that problem just with those skills alone. So with that, I'd like to conclude and say, please vote. What was our number? We're B. Are you doing the clicker again? What are we? B. B on the voting. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to our speakers for their arguments. We do need to move into our final vote. I will read the motion once again. This House believes that the rise in populism is the result of the failure of education. So please grab your clickers and vote for, against, or I hope there's nobody undecided at this point. You can proceed to voting. 10 seconds, 15 seconds. Well, that's a celebration. Well, there's definitely a sway in the vote. 44% for the motion, 51% against, and 5% undecided. So the motion is dismissed. Thank you very much, honorable speakers, and everyone on the floor. Thank you so much.
Debate.